Today we're going to talk about mind-matter dynamics and what I think is potentially the biggest misconception when it comes to any kind of immaterial material dynamic or any conception thereof. And let's just go ahead and clarify that this is going to extend to any immaterial material dynamic, soul body, mind matter, ideal material, spiritual material, whatever. Really, any of these things. Now, a lot of people, I'd say the prevailing understanding of how these two things work in conjunction with one another is that they are two things to begin with. So that's a mistake, but let's get a little bit more specific than that. It would be a kind of possessive relationship, which is to say that not only that the soul possesses a body, as in the body belongs to the soul, which would be true, but rather that the soul kind of possesses it like in the way that you might think of a demon possessing somebody. Like it enters into a body that is extrinsic to it. Aristotle's hylomorphism, at least some interpretations, and there actually might be a better way to understand his hylomorphism, where the soul is the form of the body, and that's why, and the body is like the matter, right? And the form of the body impresses itself onto this extrinsic matter. I think this is also a mistake, even if there's implied to be some kind of sympathy, given that matter is conceived to be something that receives impressions. It's a receptive, not principle, but for lack of a better word, principle. Most of those Greeks would probably argue there's no arche of matter, which is true. Meaning there has to be an explanation of matter's receptiveness and the nature of matter within what does have a principle, but I haven't seen many explicit explanations of that in Greek philosophy. However, let's continue. I just wanted to point out that conception of hylomorphism, Aristotle's peripatetic hylomorphism. Anyways, basically the idea that a soul, that a body pre-exists the soul in some way, or not pre-exists, but exists externally to it, and the soul enters into the body, and the body becomes like a sepulcher. So this also gets into Pythagorean transmigration, which is also a bad way of understanding reincarnation, because it implies the soul to be a transmigrant that is actually moving between extrinsic bodies, and that when that body decays, so kind of like Ken Wheeler or Theoria Apophosis's radio analogy, once that radio is destroyed, the signal is like free to move or free to be channeled, modulated by some other radio. And I think this is a wrong conception because it reifies the objective world into an ontological state, and it's not. This would also be a mistake implied in any kind of emanationist model that actually puts matter or the material world as simply an increase in the hypostatic procession, like as though matter proceeded from soul in the same way that soul proceeds from nous. And it doesn't in the same way. It's not it's not like principally consistent with the one nous and soul and matter, right? And I don't think any of the Greeks would have argued that. Plotinus surely did not argue that, but just some people, I've seen diagrams that show that, and that is incorrect. What matter is to Plotinus is something that is not ontological. but I'm not gonna. This is where the references will end, because now I'm gonna explain what my theory of what the material world actually is. Because if I keep basing this off references, it'll kind of slow me down here. But the material world is essentially the soul's self-perception. It's something that occurs completely internally to the soul in a way that it essentially, well, we'll have to answer perceiving what? It's perceiving its own condition. This isn't an ontological condition. It's more like, it is kind of a phantasmal condition, because it's not something that affects the soul as a soul, in the same way that a mind assuming any kind of condition or state does not actually change the mind from a mind into something else. The condition that a soul assumes is not a condition of soul that changes soul into a different kind of soul, right? Soul will always metastructurally be the same. So, which is unlimited in a way, and then conditions are limited in a way, meaning that condition or limit, the limits kind of assumed by a soul to develop this condition, is actually a kind of self-definition. So I write a lot about this idea of auto-definitionalism, and I have a paper that'll be released sometime in the next month, or not month, but, you know, in the coming months. And this kind of definition is not something that changes soul into anything other than a soul, or reality into anything other than reality. Although, of course, the condition that is developed has to kind of initially be mapped off of what the soul is. So it's like a map of the metastructure, which if you would think of the very first souls or beings, perhaps the Henads, they would be the most universal, defined by the most universal conditions, because they'd be directly mapped off of the metastructure. Not that there's any way to deviate from any kind of mapping, but there is particularization involved. And this definition, of course, isn't ontological. It's something that the soul has a capacity to kind of develop this understanding, this condition that is not ontological. So this is something we have to understand about the nature of souls or minds, is that it can do this without like it's just something that is by default a part of it, and doesn't have to arise like extrinsically, so to speak. So anyways, what matter, or the material world, is, because I don't want to confuse anyone with like a Platonian notion of matter, what the material world is the soul's perception of this condition rendered to itself as an image. So our souls, take our souls, for instance, we have we have relatively particular conditions, relative to all of the, like, the more universal conditions we can think of. More particular conditions are particularizations of universal conditions, entering into compositions which create new souls to, you know, assume those more particular conditions. So the pluralization of soul, which also isn't ontological. Okay, soul, the essential soul that everybody has is the same. It's even if you think of it as like a plurality of monads, a bare monad is always the same. The condition of that monads enter into is what creates an apparent like plurality of souls. And this pluralization process occurs at the exact same time as the particularization. They're basically the same thing. And if you had, this would be similar to like the Platonic theory of forms, where you have perhaps the most universal conditions as the forms, and they kind of have an interplay which creates composition. But my theory is saying that this kind of interplay between the universal conditions is what creates increasingly particular conditions that goes on, you know, who knows, maybe infinitely. Maybe infinitely particular conditions. But we have, you know, a relatively particular condition, which actually lends us a greater degree of definition. So the greater the degree of definition, the greater the degree of particularity, and the greater the degree of plurality, because there's more particulars than there are universals, right? Well, the truly universal is singular, so really the first universals, plural, would be the least particular in a way, but still somewhat particular, if that makes sense. I'm trying to not like jumble this around too much, because I know this could potentially get confusing fast, but I'm hoping this makes sense. An increase in definition is an increase in particularity. For instance, there are, every red square is a square, but not every square is red, right? So that increase in particularity is an increase in definition. So, and that's kind of just necessary to understand that the soul also has this faculty for perceiving definition and rendering consciousness would essentially, or objective empirical consciousness. You could potentially have consciousness in itself, which is simply this self-aware faculty. It's just not aware of any objective nature or any like object in the sense of materiality. It would just be potentially aware, not aware of anything in particular. In order to have that, it would then become objective consciousness, which isn't ontologically different from this like theoretical subjective consciousness. But we're going to say that this objective consciousness is object oriented, and objects is the self-objectification of conditions. So the objective world we experience is the self-objectification of the soul's self-objectification of its condition. Okay. Which is rendered to it via consciousness. Consciousness is like its orientation onto this condition, and it's simply rendered as an image of that condition, right? That's like how, like our experience of objectivity and conditions, and let's say objectivity or materiality, because I want this to be, we'll use terms that are like, I like to throw in a lot of terms just in case one term is understood better by one person than another. So soul's experience of objectivity or materiality is the soul's experience of its own self-definition, which is really just a condition that it's assumed, and the way it experiences it is by way of kind of imaging it to itself. It's rendered to itself, and we could say in a way accidentally, although like don't be careful in your interpretation of accident here, but accidentally the way that these conditions are rendered to the soul is by way of images. Although of course this is like necessary, like this is the way that reality works, but in a way accidentally. That's just, it's kind of like the format by which this happens. So let's recap a little bit. This occurs entirely internally to the soul. So what is the dynamic between a soul and its body? Why is there kind of like a focal point? Because we experience objectivity, as individual souls, as a kind of focal point with our eyes. That's how we experience it. That's how it's rendered to us. And our body is the most relative to us, with like spatial awareness, and then our surroundings are, more or less relative to us according to the degree to which they're literally relative to us. And if you have definition, that actually necessitates relativity or relations, because one instance of definition is always relative to what it is not, what is closer in definition to it, what is further in definition from it. Which also, that exact thing, by the way, explains precisely why particularity necessitates plurality. So, but that's not what this video is about. But it is important. Anyways, So yeah, that basically that gives you the key to understanding why we experience objectivity the way we do. We experience objectivity the way we do because definition is always relative. You can't have like isolated definition because you always have what it is defined against, what the object of definition is defined against. And what it always implies what could be more similar and relative to it and what isn't. So there's a lot you can extrapolate from that actually explains reality, very efficiently. Maybe not perfectly, but pretty efficiently. So that explains why we have a body and why we have a body relative to, our external surroundings, our apparently external surroundings, which actually do have to have some kind of presence in the condition of our soul, because that condition implies other conditions, relative conditions. The kind of trifecta of terms I like to use to explain these concepts is definition, condition, relation. The definition is that of the condition. They're kind of interchangeable. Maybe I need to refine that a little bit, but these things always imply relation of greater and lesser degrees. And there can be a privation of definition because it's not ontological. It's not something that is fundamentally, essentially real. However, I would argue that the process of self-definition is something that is intrinsic to the soul. Like the capacity to do that, to do what it's doing right now, has to be intrinsic to the soul and ultimately to fundamental reality, to the primary principle. Because if you have a primary principle, everything has to be grounded in the primary principle in some way, according to the degree that it is actually, real wherever in reality, because the primary principle is... Actually, I plan on making a video about this. It'd be very important, but I digress for now. So final recap. The material world is not something that exists externally to the immaterial world, because the immaterial principle is fundamental. So the material needs to be explained in terms of immateriality, which is what I just did, in a really efficient way. And I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on it. So souls do not enter into bodies, even spirits. I think that the concept of like a pneumatic vehicle is kind of, I think that should be re-examined. I don't think spirits enter into objectively externally existent bodies. So bodies essentially manifest internally to soul. And I mean like manifest. And I believe there is a cycle of manifestation and unmanifestation, and that cycle accords exactly according to what we talked about a little bit earlier, the soul's orientation onto its condition, which I think focuses, concentrates, and deconcentrates or unconcentrates. This is how our minds work. We get tired. It makes sense that this would be principally consistent to a higher degree with souls. And the body's aging is essentially deconcentration. Its aging is concentration. It is not fully concentrated until you are an adult. So this is why, children are not like fully there in a way. In retrospect, this might be familiar feeling. It was for me. I feel like I wasn't fully there in retrospect. Of course, you don't realize this while you are a child, but, yeah, and this occurs internally to the soul. This isn't out there. There is no world out there. This is all in your soul, in the soul. It's all in the soul, and I will discuss I'll make this a bit of a two-parter, and what I'll do, if anyone's interested, I will explain why precisely multiple souls, and I already touched on the plurality of souls a little bit here, but what does require further explaining, and I have explained this, but not in video format, is why multiple souls seem to share in an experience of objective reality, and why this isn't just completely solipsistic. And there's a very, very good answer, but I don't want this video to be too long. And yeah, let me know what you guys think. I think, I haven't, I'm sure this is probably similar to some other people's conceptions. Maybe Chris Langan has said something somewhat similar, but I don't think so. But let me know what you guys think, and we'll see you in that second part.